Father Pollestad, it's an honor to have you here with us. You are a famous author, well known, and you are a loved person in the country of Norway and in Scandinavia for your work for so many years. And we're talking about the Christianization of Scandinavia, and it must have been such a splendid time to live in when Christianity first came in. Very often we hear that Norway was Christianized by the axe and the sword, but there might have been just as many geopolitical reasons, and also missionaries, the monks. And we also have Saint Ansgar, who was a German missionary to Scandinavia.
Saint Ansgar's influence didn't go further than Denmark. But the Norwegians themselves were Vikings, as you know. So they went very often abroad to plunder. But they were influenced by those whose buildings and houses they plundered. So the Christian faith came slowly to Norway, to the west coast, influenced by England originally. So we have many stone crosses from before the official Christianization of the people in the west coast, western Norway. But we say normally that the Christian kings were those who introduced the Christian faith. First Olaf Trygvasson, who was Christianized by an English hermit living on the west coast of England, who met this young Norwegian. And he was very impressed by this monk and was brought to faith by him. So then when he came back to Norway in 995, he came with the intention of bringing the faith to his people. He got 5 years. He started the work, which was fulfilled by another great Olaf, whom we today call Olaf the Saint. And he was not a saint in a traditional category. He was a Viking, of course, and he used very much sword and axe, as you said. But he ended as a martyr. You say martyr in English? Martyr at Stiklestad. He was killed there in 1030. And that was the big turning point for the new religion in our country. We got our own Christian king, who brought the Christian faith and the Christian monarchy. So that was then we were included in the European civilization, so to speak.
It was a very particular time. We know the Viking Age being from 750 approximately to 1100, and the Christianization of Norway, and we normally say date to 1030 or after that time period. But still, there were like 200 years there where you had the Vikings and the Norse culture and the heathen culture,
yes,
almost in parallel,
yes,
with some Christianization and the monasteries that came. And
they came later. They came later. But the crucial point was the law, the Christian law introduced by the Christian kings, which brought big changes. First and foremost, in the customs of people. For instance, when people died, they were normally buried at the farm. That was very important for the Vikings, to have their dead with them. Now, Church imposed on them to bury them at the church, in the churchyard, in sacred ground. And that was a big change for people. Then there was matrimony. Then the bridegroom, his father, his brothers, they went to the farm of the bride to negotiate with the bride's father and brothers on the price of the bride. So the bride was bought. And this was, of course, forbidden when the church influence came. So that was a great emancipation of the woman. Because now she also got a word. She couldn't be forced into marriage anymore. Then the marriage was invalid. The Vikings had the system of revenge also. If somebody of your family in the large sense was killed, then you had the obligation, you or your cousin or your far cousin, had the obligation to kill somebody of the murderer's family. And so it went on in a kind of escalation. It was called the blood revenge. And this was forbidden by the church. Not very successfully in the beginning, of course, but lately it influenced the customs. And then, of course, it was forbidden to set out children, because when a child was born, it was up to the father to decide whether this child should live or not. And if the father decided it was too weak or something, it was put out in nature and died. So this was also forbidden by the church, of course.
I believe a number of these laws actually came into being with Olav the Holy, as we say.
Yes.
Is it true that sorcery also was prohibited at that time, and adultery was prohibited, and so-called blood sacrifice as well, and all the old heathen traditions?
Yes, they were all forbidden. But of course you can't forbid human nature, so adultery and things like that, and also revenge, that went on, of course. It was called a sin, so a sin you had to confess, but the church had no illusion of abolish human nature, you see, of course. And we know, for instance, the Catholic priests who were officially living in celibacy. Celibacy was introduced in the church around 500, but in Norway it never had a success. So practically all the priests who were not in a convent or a monastery, they had what they called a frille. That means a woman with whom they lived, with whom they had children, without being married. And the sons in such marriages, the sons could not be priests unless they got the dispense of the Pope, which they very easily got. So many priests here in the Middle Ages were sons of priests.
And Olav the Holy is a very interesting character,
Yes.
mainly also because he was some sort of political revolutionary. He was the one that took the European kingship and system of state system, actually, and introduced it to Norway.
He introduced the Christian monarchy. I would not call him a revolutionary because he had all the power. So he didn't, he fought for the Christian faith, but the Christian faith for him meant that now we should have a society like the European monarchies. And that he founded here. But he was not a saint in the traditional way. I mean, he was a Viking. And when we read the sagas, we see that very clearly. But he was a saint because he died as a martyr. He was killed. And after his death, there was no heathen reaction in Norway. We don't see any indication of that. And there were some miracles also after his death. His coffin was buried up in Trondheim, and after 1 year it came up by itself. And when they opened it, they found that his hair and beard had grown almost as much, the saga said, almost as much as if he had been living in this world. And so the bishop cut his hair and his beard so that it was exactly like when he died. And then when they burned this, it didn't burn. And there were some other miracles, and so he was declared by the bishop a saint and became the national saint, the patron of Norway, got the title Rex Perpetuus Norvegiae, Norway's eternal king.
And there were a number of miracles,
Yes,
so
afterwards.
I've heard, that
Yes.
happened afterwards,
Yes.
that started the trend that people came from everywhere in Norway,
Yes.
in order to worship him.
Already when he was dead, the same night, there was a blind man coming into the place where the king's corpse was lying. And he came to touch the king's blood and touched his eye, and he became seeing afterwards. That was one of the many miracles that happened. And where the king had been buried in Trondheim, there came up a source, which was there during the whole Middle Ages. And very many pilgrims came there and were cured from diseases. So this was a very strong place for 500 years in Norway. And we have the biggest church in Norway lying there up in Trondheim. And pilgrims came from all over Europe. to Saint Olaf in Nidaros, as he was called.
When you compare with the stories from the Bible as well, you see the naturalness of miracles and good things happening once people touch holy people. Also with the story of Paul in the New Testament,
Yes,
there's a
yes.
story of people touching his clothes, and the same with Jesus. So,
Yes.
so this has clearly biblical
Of course, yes.
connotations
Of course,
and,
yes.
and has to do with the miraculous, which is also very exciting, and the
Yes.
supernatural,
Yes.
which interests us very much
And
today.
Saint Olaf was on the altar of the cathedral at Trondheim for 500 years, until the Reformation. And every year, the 29th of July, which was the day of his death, his coffin was carried in procession around the church 3 times, and all the pilgrims, they gathered to touch the coffin, and it said that many were cured. And this coffin was of silver. So when the Reformation came, the Danish king took the coffin. St. Olaf was buried somewhere, but the coffin was melted, and they made money from it to pay the Danish king's wars. So it disappeared. And the king was buried in front of the altar first, but then people, of course, even if they had become officially Protestants, they still went there to greet St. Olaf. So this, in 1664, this was taken away. And now we don't know where his grave is, because they had to hide him to stop the popular cult of this martyr king, yes.
Today we seem to hear mostly that Scandinavia was Christianized by the axe. But when we look at saints such as Olav the Holy, who wasn't that saintly, as you say, first of all, it's interesting to compare to the biblical stories as
Yes,
well, because
yes.
when we look at the Old Testament, I mean, none of them were that saintly. They lived a rough life, and they were warriors and
Yes.
had different vocations, and they made mistakes, and all their mistakes are written clearly about. I've heard also that he had a dream of returning to Norway, and that his, maybe not death, but the things he did would end up uniting the country, and quenching some of the negative issues remaining from the Viking Age.
Yes. Of course, it's very difficult to judge all the sources we have. And our Icelandic story writer, Snorri, he was very critical to his sources, fortunately. So then he was quite reliable, I think. He put away all the things that were too miraculous. But he gives some details on St. Olaf's piety. For instance, it was very severe if you did something, if you did a piece of work on a Sunday. Sunday was to be holy, no work. And the king sat with his knife and he cut in some wood one Sunday. And then one of his servants said, "It's Monday tomorrow, Lord. It's Monday tomorrow." And then the king suddenly became aware it's Sunday today. So he took all the pieces of wood that he put in his hand, put fire on it and let them burn it in his hand to punish himself for having worked on a Sunday. A little medieval detail on this man.
And it's wonderful thinking about Olav the Holy as well, to see how he participated in the Norwegian culture and bringing such women's right to quench the abortion system, to bring up proper marriage.
Christian laws. He just introduced the Christian laws on these matters.
It's a man that should be hailed by the feminists, modern feminists of today, and should be remembered and venerated really much more than what he is. And that's why it's so wonderful to hear these stories. Would you be so kind, Father, to give us your advice as to which values do you think we need to focus more on in modern-day Scandinavia and Europe?
Oh, it's very difficult to give values for other people today, because we live in a pluralistic society and everybody feels authorized to give himself his own values. That is our system today, and that it was like that also in the Roman Empire. So we are back where we once were when the Christian faith came into the world. It came into a pluralistic society. So therefore, first and foremost, we should also study thoroughly the old sources that we have, the Christian fathers from antiquity. And the second thing is that I myself feel very privileged that in this globalized society, that I have this foundation in the Christian faith. I think that is a privilege. I feel it like a privilege to know where we are going, where we come from. So I can say with the great Christian author in Norway, Sigrid Undset, who became the Nobel Prize, I have lived for 1,000 years in this country, and so have I. I mean, if you know all this long story, and all what the Christian faith has given this country, both as in its Catholic form as in its Protestant form, because also Protestantism has given very much to our country's cultural history, very much valuable. So I think that if people have these roots, they will much easier live and also receive different people when they are themselves safe where they on which foundation they stand. So I think it's easier to talk with Muslims, for instance, if you yourself believe in God, if you have a God, then you are on the same wave in a certain manner. So I think the big danger of Europe today is that we are trying to take away our roots, to lose the consciousness of our tradition and our history. And then we are in the open air like leaves blowing around in the wind. So therefore I think that if we are to meet future with confidence, and we should also have with us our past.